should also make all discussant hosts, and I'm looking at the panel and I'm not seeing that, so I'm going to try. I don't know if, okay, good. So now everybody's host. Excellent.
Yeah, I had some technical issues because I didn't give the computer the access to my screen. So yeah, so I'm going to present my master's thesis guarding the Sino-Soviet border territorial disputes of China. Just a background knowledge or like an overview of my paper. This paper mainly examines the 1969 Sino-Soviet border conflict, along with other Sino-Soviet relationship conflicts and development, from basically the start of the PRC, People's Republic of China, till the collapse of the Soviet Union. I tested 3 hypotheses using qualitative data. As you probably have read from my paper, the 3 hypotheses are balance of threat explanation. So this is a very realist argument that China is trying to China had felt threatened by the Soviet Union in 1960s and decided to start a conflict with the Soviet Union. The second hypothesis is connected with China's domestic political problems, namely the cultural conflict, the Cultural Revolution, which provides an argument for a nationalistic sentiment that both mobilized the public as well as the government to take a very hawkish, strong stand against any foreign provocations. The third hypothesis is the ideological explanation, which basically originated from the ideological divergence between Mao and Khrushchev in the late 1950s and early 1960s. This argument is mainly for that China and Soviet Union had different visions for the future of the communist bloc, and such divergence prompt a conflict between the 2 countries, like a real military conflict instead of just diplomatic diplomatic exchanges. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first present some background knowledge about why this conflict is worth studying, and what the past literature has been said about this problem, about this issue, and then I will present my evidence gathered from several archives and online newspaper archives, and then I would conclude which hypothesis I think is the strongest among the 3 after examining my own evidence. So here is the map of the Sino-Soviet border, and you can see that here there's a star sign that marks where the conflict had happened. Very interestingly, this is actually a piece of original archival document I took picture of from the Nixon Presidential Archive. So it is very worth noting that the United States has paid a lot of attention to this conflict because there was an impending worried that there would be a nuclear war between the two communist countries, since both of them possessed nuclear weapons at the time of the conflict, which is March 1969. So there's a narrative of the border conflict between among the two countries, and they are slightly different to say at least. But why is it so important for those two countries to fight over some islands, like I showed here, some islands along the Usuri River in 1969? That is because there has been border conflict from at least 19th century, early 19th century till the establishment of the Soviet Union. This is a map of those of the two countries. Well, that is basically the prototypes of the two countries, Imperial Russia and Imperial China in 1820. So back then, there was like the disputed territory that I mentioned before belonged to China on this map. And then after some treaties were signed in late 19th century, you can see that the territory, the borderline has shifted further down south, and the Russian Empire has taken over said territory. And then we see that in the time of the PRC and the Soviet Union, the border is even more defined on this area, and this is important. This might not be important to the Soviet narrative of this conflict, but it is important to the Chinese political narrative of this conflict, because of this historical significance of the border. China had claimed that they had historical rights to claim such territory. So as I discussed, there was 3 hypotheses, and I expected to find the following evidence if the hypothesis is true and or false. So if the hypothesis 1 is true, we would say we would see weakened military capability inside China, and increasing concerns from the Chinese government to the Soviet threat. Basically, it is actually the argument of I think Taylor Freewell's study on China's security problems, that when China considered itself weak and foreign threats strong, it would preemptively attack the opponent. If the hypothesis, the first hypothesis is wrong, we would see a confidence of the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, and also a provocation of Soviet troops. The second hypothesis, if it is true, we would expect to find domestic unrest that threatens the survival of the Communist Party in China. So therefore, they would seek their own survival over rational strategic decisions. It is important to remember that in this Cultural Revolution in China started in 1966. So the domestic turmoil might have forced the Chinese leadership to mobilize nationalistic sentiments, especially against foreign powers or Western aggressions, to consolidate its control over the country and the public. So, and then there's also, we might find a sharp increase in anti-Soviet propaganda in the public discourse in China. And then if that is not true, we would expect to find no significant changes in the style of propaganda or the content of propaganda that is used by Chinese government. And then we would also see a very a relatively rational or reasonable would be a wrong word, like rational, realistic decision making in the foreign policy making process. The third hypothesis.
1 minute left only. Just a kind reminder.
Okay. So yeah. So the third hypothesis, we would expect to find military mobilization targeting the Soviet Union, which is similar to the previous two, and then an intensification of ideological debate. Since I don't have much time left on this, I would jump to conclusion that I find the second hypothesis to be the most convincing, as at least for the documents and sources I have by the end of last July, because we have seen a significant change in the past 3 years against the Soviet Union in the Chinese public political discourse, mostly in their newspapers. And there are, but for hypothesis one, there were other conflicts going on in the meantime in the 1960s, like the Indo-China conflict, but they didn't have a near nuclear war with each other. And hypothesis three, as I said before, is more accurate in the Khrushchev area instead of the Brezhnev area, which is since 1960, by the end of 1964. So that is a summary of my arguments. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I only regret that we have not so much time to listen to all of what you got to say. Juliette, do you want to make any comments on this presentation?
I wonder if we should maybe listen to all the presentations and then exchange comments. I'm just mindful of the time. What would you prefer?
It's up to you guys. That was my primary proposition, that we make comments after every presentation. But if you prefer it that way, let's listen.
If it's just two of us making comments, then I'm happy to comment. I took notes, but
I'm not. Yeah, the paper that I was supposed to discuss on is not presented today. So, but I got some comments to our papers. So maybe let's make them right now, okay?
Okay. So it's a very interesting three hypotheses. Now, do I say PE? Is that right? What's your
yes,
first
that's it. That is right.
Right. So I think it's a very interesting hypothesis. Now, again, because we didn't hear everything in your research, I'm just going to raise it as a potential issue for you to consider. The relationship between China and Soviet Union always has been very complex and conflicting. And as you know, probably from your research and historically, Chinese idea of the Communist Party and the Soviet idea of the Communist Party have diverged. And I wonder if you might want to include in your research, and maybe it's already in there, the influence of the Brezhnev doctrine on the attitude of China. Because, that doctrine specifically, in contravention of a lot of international public law, dogmas, has stated that if we don't like your Communist Party regime, we're going to come in and overthrow it and make it comply with the Soviet idea, just flexing the muscle of those years superpowers of Soviet Union. So I think that dynamic may have figured into that conflict and the resolution, and why China and Soviet ex-former Soviet Union were almost willing to go to nuclear war. It was a great ideological struggle. So I'm not sure if you're figuring the Brezhnev doctrine into your analysis, but that's something that I would consider for you as a suggestion.
Okay. Can I respond or
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, I think that is an excellent point. Yes, I didn't, well, I included some of the Brezhnev shift in foreign policy, especially his attitude with the West, in my paper. But it was not one of my detailed source that I have mentioned, I feel enough in this paper. So yeah, I will definitely look more into that.
And, you know, the reason I brought it up is because, of course, Czechoslovakia was invaded in 1968, right? And your situation is a year later. So there is, you know, if you're talking about the microcosm of the communist satellite states back then, it was also a very complex set of relationships. And China has never been happy with any of that, you know, that state of influence that the former Soviet Union exerted. So I wonder if you might want to consider looking at it from that perspective. Otherwise, I think it's a very good research, and obviously we didn't hear about a lot of it, but I did review your paper, so thank you.
Yeah, yeah, Prague Spring is definitely a very interesting point in the communist bloc. The thing I was considering is that I didn't mention that much was because Czechoslovakia is relatively not nuclear power at that time. So I was trying to introduce more on the what's the word? I can't remember the word. This the nuclear powers among during the Cold War instead of just the communist bloc. But that is a really good point. Yeah.
Just a short comment from my side, if you allow me. I generally sympathize with your view that, you know, this identity-centric approach provide us with, you know, valuable perspective on not only Soviet Sino relations, but also on Russian Chinese relations nowadays. Add this feeling of superiority from a Chinese side at its centerpiece. And I really admit and support this approach when it comes to the Russian-Chinese relations, which can be adopted even currently. And what I also found out in your paper, but not only in yours, because this is a general approach to the international relations theories, is that we often try to prove that some of them are, I mean, that one theory or another is better, or you know, explain some phenomena or events in a better way than other. Why I believe we should not treat them like this. We should use them as an approaches, as an perspectives which they open for us while studying the international relations events. And this is unfortunately the international relation theories are rarely used by us in this way. We most often try to prove that some of them are right, some of them are wrong, and they are simply showing us this, you know, various answers to the same questions, allowing us to check, you know, to test, to analyze the issue from different perspective. Simply, okay. So yes, thank you so much for your presentation once again, and I believe that Joshua maybe will have some comment on your paper and your presentation, because he is dealing with Sino-Soviet alliance as well. But now let me move forward, and Lami's presentation is next. So please, the floor is yours.
Okay, sure. 1 second, please. Let me share my slides. Yep, can you see them?
Yes, it's visible.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for being here today. I have to mention that my views expressed here are mine and do not necessarily represent the official policy of the United States government. So what I'm going to talk about today is whether China has been socialized into international non-proliferation norms. So China has been at the beginning of the nuclear era, China was very critical of the international non-proliferation norms. China criticized those treaties like the Non-Proliferation Treaty as a conspiracy of the two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, to maintain their nuclear supremacy. However, their attitude changed dramatically, kind of suddenly in the 1980s. And China started joining all these important non-proliferation regimes in the 1990s, 80s and 90s. And so people have argued that the reason, sorry, I don't know why it's, okay. So the reason why China joined those non-proliferation regimes is because China has been socialized into those regimes. China has really embraced those non-proliferation norms. But then there are some conflicting signals. Just as China was joining these non-proliferation regimes, China also engaged in sensitive nuclear proliferation to sensitive nuclear systems. This is proliferating sensitive nuclear technology and materials that could be used for building nuclear weapons, especially to those countries in the Middle East and South Asia that were kind of known to be pursuing nuclear weapons. So I don't know why this is. So my research questions are the following. So what caused the shift in China's attitude toward the non-proliferation regimes in the 1980s and 1990s? Has China really embraced the non-proliferation norms, or China has other factors driven China's non-proliferation behavior? So I'm really not doing this. I don't know why this is happening. So I'm basically testing the socialization hypothesis. And if the socialization hypothesis is true, one of the following two scenarios must be true. Either the China joined those regimes because China has embraced those norms and it has complied with them, or China joined those regimes for non-normative reasons, for other reasons, but still China has embraced those norms since it joined the non-proliferation regimes. So my argument is that China's non-proliferation behavior has been driven by economic and strategic calculations rather than normative values. China's decision to join those regimes was actually because China was interested in receiving civil nuclear assistance, especially from the United States. And since China joined those regimes, it can't conclude that China has faithfully fulfilling all those obligations of those regimes. So we'll first talk about why China joined those regimes, and then examine whether China has complied with those regimes, and then conclude with some theoretical and policy implications. So as I mentioned briefly, China joined these regimes in order to receive civil nuclear assistance from the United States. Well, China tested its first nuclear weapons in 1964, but didn't really have the capacity and technology necessary to build nuclear energy. And in the 1980s is when China was really developing its economy, significantly, and really needed energy. And then they decided that ultimately they really needed nuclear energy to meet the growing demands for energy. But then the problem was that China didn't have the technology, and also the United States refused to provide those assistance because of China's poor non-proliferation and proliferation track records. Although there were other countries like France that had the technology that China wanted, but still China really wanted to cooperate with the United States because I don't want to get into technical details, but China really wanted the US technology. And so the United States specifically demanded China to terminate its sensitive nuclear assistance and then join these regimes in order to receive nuclear assistance. In order to assess whether China has fulfilled its obligations required by non-proliferation regimes, I use the theoretical this conceptualization of cooperation with international regimes proposed by Kastner and others as my theoretical framework. Basically, they argue that in order to determine a country's cooperation with international regimes, you have to look at two things. One is what they call the first order of cooperation, which refers to abiding by the letter and spirit of the rules. So formally written rules and also spirit of the rules. And then the second order cooperation, which this is more sort of a deeper degree, more proactive degree of cooperation that aims to enhance the cooperation of the regimes generally, enhance the strength of the regimes. So first of all, when it comes to the first order of cooperation, China has violated region rules by proliferating some sensitive technology and materials to Iran and Pakistan, and also provided missiles to those countries are known to be nuclear aspirants. Although this is not a direct violation of rules, but this is a violation of the spirit of the rules. When it comes to the second order of cooperation, China also has failed to do more than it is necessary, more than required by the rules, but that would help enhancing the non-proliferation regimes. I don't want to go into too much detail, but China has export control rules, but Beijing is reluctant to enforce them fully, and also China doesn't really require like its recipients to refrain from developing nuclear fissile materials, which the United States does, but China is really reluctant to do that. China has been reluctant to press nuclear proliferators like North Korea and Iran. It is true that China has agreed to impose UN sanctions, but American policymakers in an archival document show that China, try to dilute the strength of UN sanctions against those countries. So to conclude, this paper refutes the claim that China has been socialized into the non-proliferation norms. China's integration into these regimes was driven by its interest in civil nuclear assistance. And China's behavior since then has not been, sufficient to conclude that China has really embraced those norms. So this paper provides an alternative explanation to the socialization explanation. And when it comes to the supply side of nuclear proliferation literature, it contributes to the literature by demonstrating a positive effect of civil nuclear assistance and non-proliferation, because in this literature, the mainstream view is that civil nuclear assistance increases the risk of nuclear proliferation, but this case shows that actually civil nuclear assistance in this case decrease the risk of nuclear proliferation. From a policy perspective, China is rising as a leader in the nuclear export market. And if China hasn't embraced non-proliferation norms, then from the US perspective, from the government, and we have reasons to worry that China may not behave responsibly when China becomes the leader in the nuclear market. Well, thank you for your attention. And I have to say that I think that my paper, it seems a little bit misplaced. It doesn't really talk about the Soviet Union, but anyways, thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for following the time regime. Juliette?
Yes, thank you for that. A little disclaimer, I'm not a Chinese expert, although I spent many years doing business in China. I'm more of a dinosaur of the Soviet era days. In fact, I have a certificate in Soviet law that hangs on my wall. So I understand the dynamic, but I'm curious what you have raised about China. We do study China and watch what China does very closely from the US foreign policy point of view, of course. So again, I think your research is right on point, but as by way of a suggestion coming from not an expert, here's what I was thinking as I was listening to your paper. In terms of foreign policy, I think Chinese government really is very sensitive to its position as the upstanding global citizen, right? So they do want to have this recognition. And so becoming a bad actor in terms of, the dealings in nuclear weapons and not participating in the non-proliferation discussions and agreements taints that reputation. I think that reputational piece, again, I believe it's quite important in the Chinese foreign policy. The other thing I think that perhaps greatly influences, well, two more things that greatly influences China. China is concerned about the well-being of its own backyard, right? So they don't really want to create this nuclear oasis with other nuclear players that could potentially damage China. Right, so the relationship and the dynamic between India, Pakistan, and Iraq, and the U.S. interest and Chinese interest, it's all closer to China. It's not our backyard, right? It's Chinese backyard. So I think those two things, and of course, when China wants to be good participant in international affairs, when our relationship, U.S.-China relationship is good, then they're more willing to negotiate. When the relationship is bad, they're not willing to negotiate. And it's similar dynamic between, Chinese and the Soviets, because now we know for a fact they have very little in common, even though the ideology is called communist. So anyway, I think you might want to look a little bit more on the neighborhood kind of and the aspects of the neighborhood, considering the health of the neighborhood for China that may influence the non-proliferation decision one way or the other. So. If that made sense, I'm not sure if that fits within your read. It's more of a global policy statement, but I hope it's helpful.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thank you very much.
And a very short comment and hint from my side. You concluded that the United States of America failed to socialize China when it comes to non-proliferation, when it comes to free market, when it comes to international organization. But I think that you should ask yourself and maybe include this question to your project: why United States failed to socialize China? Maybe this is a question for another project that you would like to make in the future, but it's worth considering. And in here again, this Chinese specificity is something you need to elaborate on, what Juliet just mentioned. But anyway, I really enjoyed your presentation and took a brief look at your paper. And this is a comment to all of you guys. I will provide you definitely after this conference with more detailed comments on your papers. So please be waiting for them. And this is how we come to Stephen's presentation. So now we are going into intelligence studies and history. So Stephen, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you all hear me? And,
yes.
And you can see my screen?
As well.
Okay, very good. Well, good afternoon. My name is Stephen Ford, and I'm a graduate student at American Military University, where I am studying national security. I've always had an interest in the Cuban Missile Crisis and the way the US intelligence community was caught off guard so easily. I contacted my friend and mentor, Dr. Bill Stindy, and asked for his observations about the subject, and he described his point of view when he was in high school at the time of the crisis. I became even more interested, and he suggested that we collaborate on a paper together for the MPSA conference. Although history may not repeat itself, it rhymes. Lessons learned from events in the past can often be used to give us better perspective on the present, although we must remember that rarely are two events ever exactly alike. On October 14th, 1962, an American U-2 spy plane photographed a construction site of Russian SS-4 missiles at San Cristobal, Cuba. Upon learning the news, President Kennedy quickly formed ExComm, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, a streamlined committee of top national security and foreign policy advisors. The research question for our paper is, how much of a role did the failures of the intelligence community impact the outcome of the event? And our thesis, much of the blame for the surprise of the Cuban Missile Crisis rests upon the collection failures of the American intelligence community. And we should note that the purpose of this paper was not intended to bash the American CIA, but rather to use this event as an example of intelligence gathering mistakes that were made, which could have had catastrophic consequences, but thankfully did not. Declassification of intelligence documents with the help of FOIA requests have helped us better understand behind the scenes, but the majority of research is from the American perspective, which has left some gaps. Raymond Garthoff, who at the time was a special assistant for the State Department, views the crisis from a very moderate perspective, and he takes the view that having more intelligence may not have necessarily helped the situation at the time, but would have muddied the waters and complicated the decision-making process even further. Throughout the paper, we use standardized abbreviations for certain names and acronyms. For example, IC stands for Intelligence Community and refers to not only the CIA, but other agencies affiliated with gathering intelligence, including the National Security Agency, as well as the Defense Intelligence Agency, both under the Department of Defense. HUMINT, SIGINT, and COMINT are different forms of intelligence collection techniques using human and electronic sources and specific communication intercepts. And the SS-4 Sandal is a Soviet-made medium-range ballistic missile that was first spotted in Cuba by U-2 overflights on October 14th. The stress points, or the variables for our paper, include misreading HUMINT, selective SIGINT, introduction of Soviet tactical nuclear weapons, underestimating Soviet troop strength in Cuba, and misinterpreting Khrushchev's intentions. The Soviet codename for the operation to move nuclear missiles to Cuba was called Operation Anadir. And coincidentally, I was just sent an article by Dr. Stindy this morning that mentions the Soviet move in the North Arctic, and one of the bases that they're using is indeed Anadir. At any rate, Anadir is a region in the far north, remote part of Russia. And the Soviet troops initially were issued cold weather gear and then later changed into civilian clothing en route. This was all part of Soviet military doctrine called Maskirovka, or denial and deception. At the same time, in the summer of 1962, the CIA was an agency under construction with a new director of Central Intelligence, John McCone. McCone was a civilian businessman with no intelligence experience, who wanted to de-emphasize covert operations and instead rely upon whole house intelligence collaboration with an emphasis on analysis. Throughout the autumn of 1962, the CIA had been receiving reports from multiple sources that there were missiles and equipment spotted inside Cuba. The upper echelon at the CIA, however, dismissed these reports as all part of Soviet disinformation. On September 10th, 1962, National Security Advisor Bundy and Secretary of State Rusk asked the Committee on Overhead Reconnaissance to stop the bi-monthly U-2 overflights of Cuba that had been routine from earlier that year. They were fearful of a repeat of another shoot-down incident because surface-to-air missile launchers had been spotted on the island in late August. This decision to limit the U-2 overflights is known as the photo gap, and essentially blinded US intelligence officers from the fact that what was actually happening in Cuba was that the Soviets were moving missiles onto the island. In addition, the NSA, which specializes in SIGINT, intercepted messages from Soviet missile officers stationed in Cuba to their families back in Russia. These intercepts, however, were deemed, quote, highly suspicious, end quote, by the NSA, and were classified low priority. NSA comment identified several Cuba-bound ships leaving Russian ports, but misidentified the cargo on board, which in fact turned out to be the SS-4 missiles. DCI McCone warned administration officials that the Soviets could be deploying MRBMs in Cuba as early as August 10th. based upon multiple intelligence sources. This view was not shared, however, among analysts at the CIA or the national security advisors to the administration. One of the most intriguing aspects of this crisis is the deployment of Soviet tactical weapons. Unlike the SS-4 missiles, these weapons were never discovered by US intelligence, and their presence was not revealed until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989, many years after the fact. The Soviets deployed 2 free rocket over ground, or FKR-1, regiments with a total of 80 warheads, which accounted for over half of the nuclear weapons on Cuba. 30 years after the crisis, Kennedy's Defense Secretary Robert McNamara met with former Soviet Minister Andrei Gromyko and other key Soviet officials in a series of meetings regarding the events of 1962. At the conference, which was held in Havana, US officials would learn the full details of the tactical nuclear weapons on the island during the crisis. And one of the most startling features was the fact that McNamara was told that the Soviet commanders in charge of the missile batteries were given complete autonomy to launch the tactical nuclear warheads without permission from Moscow in case of an American invasion, and the fact that communications had been cut. Another important aspect is the failure of the intelligence estimates, which significantly undercounted the number of Soviet troops deployed to Cuba. In early October, the official CIA estimate was the Soviets had 4,000 to 4,500 troops. However, CIA Task Force W, which is on the operations side at CIA, estimated the number closer to 45 or 50,000. The actual number was 41,900. Somehow this report got lost in the shuffle, and perhaps the reason for this is the CIA was so firmly entrenched in their doctrinal belief that the Soviets would not deploy nuclear weapons to Cuba, that any troops in Cuba were viewed merely as advisors. Prior to the crisis, the American view of the Soviet doctrine and Khrushchev's motives was that the Soviet Union was an expansionist aggressor, but one that was very risk adverse. Many years in hindsight, Khrushchev's memoirs explored some of the motivations for deploying the nuclear weapons to Cuba. And those reasons included to deter US invasion of Cuba, to restore a strategic balance between the US and Soviet Union, and to respond to the deployment of American missiles in Turkey. Perhaps there are other reasons as well that were not mentioned in his memoirs, such as the fact that this would give Khrushchev leverage in dealing with future confrontations between the USSR and the Soviet Union, or he would prove to his party that he did indeed have control over the party, as some suspected that he may not have. Whatever the case, the September 19th Special National Intelligence Estimate from the IC to the White House evaluated the possibility of missile deployment in Cuba by the Soviets and said it was not possible because, quote, it would not be congruent with past Soviet behavior, end quote. This meant that the conclusions drawn by the IC were purely based on their assessment of Soviet intentions at the time. So these 5 collection failures outlined in this paper all produced a flawed intelligence product, which in the final analysis proved to be benign as to the outcome of the crisis. However, these collection methods may have been flawed, but not nearly as much as the way the data was interpreted. One of the primary questions that arises in the analysis of this event is the role of the IC to predict future threats. If the answer is yes, then the US intelligence network failed. From an analysis of these errors, hopefully the IC can engage in self-reflection in order to avoid these types of mistakes in the future. Today, with North Korea conducting missile launch tests and Iran demonstrating its frustration over America's alteration of JCPOA, the threat of nuclear conflict looms as a potential undercurrent in geopolitical negotiations. And all stress the need for accurate intelligence collection, which is dispassionate from political ideology and longstanding institutional practices. That is our paper, and it was a pleasure sharing our research with you. And on behalf of Dr. Stindy and myself, we thank you for your time.
Just on time, Stephen. Thank you. Juliet, please.
fascinating, and I'm certainly not in a position to comment on the actual background research. You know, again, I have more of a geopolitical view. So I have two questions for you. Maybe you can share this. So is your proposition or finding is that this was a collection failure versus a decision-making process failure, or both? And on the other side, I'm not sure if I understood you correctly. So did we learn the right lesson or did we learn the wrong lesson?
May I answer?
Absolutely. I'm really fascinated to hear it.
Great. Well, thank you for those questions. Those are some very good questions. And I think in the final analysis, it seemed like there were failures on both ends, both the collection as well as analysis. I think the decision makers had a lot of influence on the methods and the types of collection that was used. So had they been given more discretion, perhaps that could have led to having more information sooner. However, I think also the CIA in of itself was struggling with the fact of their preconceived notions over Soviet behavior. And so they, in a way, limited their own collection efforts as well. So, and as far as the lessons learned, I think, yes, I think this is both a combination of some things that we did well and what we can learn from that, but also what we did not do so well, and hopefully that we can, you know, put into place in the future. So thank you so much. Those are some great questions.
I get two methodological remarks for you, Stephen. It was not really clear for me while I was reading your paper, what is your research question and research problem. In the presentation, you emphasize it quite clearly. However, in the paper, I think it should be, you know, underlined even more. And the second methodological tip for you is to show to the audience and to readers of your paper what is new in your paper, what is innovative, what's the innovacy in your paper. Then I got a question to you. How important was this internal struggle between intelligence agencies within? You know, I don't want to, you know, to sound like a conspiracy, someone who creates conspiracy theories, but maybe you should also consider these internal struggles between intelligences when it comes to, you know, exploring reasons behind this failure. And the second thing maybe you should also consider is about Russia itself, and maybe there are some Russian advantages which simply enabled sorry, I'm saying all the time saying Russia, Soviet Union, to conduct this operation. You mentioned very briefly Maskirovka, but it's only, you know, one small paragraph. Maybe you would consider to enlarge this part of your paper.
Thank you.
Can I add one thing that just occurred to me? And Stephen, it may be totally off left field, but you know, we have these discussions very often at one of my think tanks. You know, the US foreign policy very often constrained by finding the diplomatic solution, overtly, covertly, secret negotiations. Soviets have never been constrained on any diplomatic solutions. They just wanted to make a point. So I wonder if any of this, you know, since you've done so much research in what was going on with the intelligence, you know, to what extent our intelligence sources are actually constrained or perhaps are not allowed to really utilize all the sources because there is always that doctrine of diplomatic solution first. Again, I love geopolitical. Sorry, maybe it could be just a footnote somewhere.
Yes, no, that's a very good point. So thank you. Thank you for that.
Now, last but not least, Joshua, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. 1 second. Okay, hi, so I'm Josh. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Chicago. Today, I'm going to talk about the determinants of what I call strategic incoherence in military alliances and illustrate my framework to understand this phenomenon with evidence from Soviet alliances during the Cold War. The paper I circulated draws on theory and evidence from my ongoing dissertation project. So first, let me begin by laying out my motivation. For many decades now, US policymakers have complained that despite American generosity toward its allies, they often fail to adopt the military policies required to sustain America's grand strategic interests abroad. President Kennedy argued that Francis de Gaulle launches his policies based solely on France's own self-interest, partly because he doesn't fear that the US would desert him. President Obama said that free riders aggravate him, and of course, Donald Trump incessantly complained that US allies exploit its generosity without pulling their own weight against serious security threats. Implicit in these comments is an important puzzle about alliance politics, as well as a working theory that addresses this puzzle. The question may be stated as follows: why do leading powers fail to achieve strategic coherence in their military alliances? By strategic coherence, I simply mean the fit between a leading power's grand strategy and its allies' military capabilities. The answer implicit in the comments we saw earlier is drawn from a certain theory that has become conventional wisdom in US foreign policy discourse, to the extent where I'm pretty sure all of you are to some degree familiar with it. This is what I term the collective goods theory of alliance security. This theory suggests that allies either free ride or reckless drive. So either they build too few capabilities or they build too many capabilities due to the moral hazard caused by a preponderant power oversupplying security to them. Okay, and because this moral hazard intensifies when the security provided by the leading power approximates a public or collective good, strategic coherence is more likely to be achieved when the leading power can credibly withhold its security commitments, or when allies are so severely threatened that the leading power's commitments become insufficient. Now, in this paper, I set out to dismantle this conventional wisdom and develop an alternative theory of strategic incoherence. In a nutshell, my argument is that strategic coherence is determined by the interaction between the leading power's grand strategy and its allies' military vulnerability. More specifically, incoherence tends to arise whenever the leading power's grand strategy aims to outsource military capabilities to an ally that is vulnerable to military predation, or when it aims to insource military capabilities while limiting those of a relatively vulnerable ally. My premise is that leading powers need their allies to bring different kinds and amounts of military capabilities to the table, depending on the kind of grand strategy they pursue. A grand strategy of outsourcing aims to indirectly check an adversary's growth in power by relying on the military efforts of its allies. Toward this end, the strategy demands that allies maximize their military capabilities with the leading power support, and that they adopt decision-making capacities that allow them to employ these capabilities without the leading power's directives. By contrast, an insourcing strategy demands that the leading power take on primary responsibility for checking the adversary. But as long as the leading power decides to commit the full weight of its resources to meeting the adversary's threat in the long term, it should also strive to arrogate and control the alliance's capabilities as much as possible, so that military competition doesn't escalate without its discretion. So this strategy imposes stricter limits on the type and quantity of capabilities that allies should adopt, and also requires them to tether their force employment to the leading power's decisions. On the other hand, allies sometimes cannot accommodate these prescriptions depending on their ex-ante level of military vulnerability. When an ally is vulnerable, it faces high risks of incurring costly predation from the adversary. If it attempts to militarize or build up stronger military capabilities, it is likely to invite an overwhelming arms race or preventive aggression that nullifies such efforts. The calculus turns on its head for relatively invulnerable allies. Here, the ally faces low risks of incurring predation for the moment, but it must pursue sustained improvements to its capabilities to avoid windows of vulnerability from opening up in the future. The implications of these two variables combine in a general model of strategic coherence. In this model, coherence is obtained only under two conditions. Either the leading power adopts an outsourcing strategy while its ally is relatively invulnerable, or the leading power pursues insourcing while its ally is highly vulnerable. In both cases, there will be a neat fit between the leading power's grand strategic vision and the demands of the ally security environment. Strategic incoherence should prevail otherwise, as shown on the upper right and lower left quadrants. When the leading power tries to implement outsourcing while its ally is militarily vulnerable, its prescriptions tend to trigger the ally's risks of incurring predation. The ally will either internalize this risk and refuse to adopt the leading power's demands, or it will try to accommodate and have its efforts nullified by the adversary's preventive measures. Okay. If the leading power adopts insourcing while its ally is relatively invulnerable, the ally will refuse to put up with the leading power's controlling efforts and help itself to the strongest possible capabilities. I demonstrate this theory's plausibility with evidence from the Sino-Soviet alliance and the Cuba-Soviet alliance during the Cold War. I note in the paper that these cases offer a number of methodological advantages over US alliances. I'd be happy to elaborate during the discussion if anyone's interested. But the key point for now is that these two allies were confronted with radically different levels of vulnerability. Here I use distance-adjusted ratios of their sync scores vis-a-vis the US adversary for illustration. Given these stark disparities, my theory expects Soviet outsourcing and insourcing to have opposing implications for strategic coherence in these two alliances. Turning first to the Sino-Soviet alliance, I show that the Soviet Union's outsourcing strategy from 1949 to 1957 was associated with strategic coherence. In Stalin's words, the Soviet vision at the time was to help China become the military flagship of Asia. And Moscow devolved an astonishing amount of military resources to China toward that end. China was able to accommodate this strategy because it was relatively invulnerable to US military predation. As the CIA assessed in 1954, China was able to enjoy a wide area of maneuver without incurring unacceptable US counteraction. This was by virtue of the fact that it would reliably turn any conflict into the United States, with the United States, into a protracted war of attrition. It had those capabilities. Beginning around 1958, however, the Soviets transitioned to an insourcing strategy, which meant that it began to emphasize the liberation and control in confronting US power in East Asia. In Khrushchev's words, the Soviet Union could not afford to be a gambler who bets whatever is left in his pocket and then shoots himself. And this in practice meant that it had to impose harsher limits on its allies' capabilities so as to avoid inadvertent escalation. The problem, however, was that China was relatively invulnerable to US predation and thus had few incentives to accede to Moscow's efforts to circumscribe its security policies. The Soviets threatened to abandon China if it doesn't accommodate Moscow's strategic priorities. For instance, in September 1958, it reminded the CCP of the great calamity that would ensue if the Soviet Union would allow itself not to come to China's assistance when atomic bombs had begun to fall. But soon enough, the Soviets made good on these veiled threats by actually reducing military support for China. But as shown in this figure, Chinese military growth vis-a-vis the United States was hardly affected. In short, China's military capabilities grew out of step with Soviet strategic demands after Moscow shifted its grand strategy to insource. Now, we see the opposite outcomes in the Cuba-Soviet alliance. From 1959 to 1962, the Soviets tried to implement an outsourcing strategy in the Caribbean by transferring a massive amount of military capabilities to Cuba. I show in the paper that Soviet strategy at this time ultimately envisioned turning Cuba into an independent nuclear power. Stephen kind of hinted at this phenomenon in his project, but what we know now as the Cuban Missile Crisis today was really Washington's preventively motivated response to nip that move in the bud. As Robert Kennedy told the Soviet ambassador in September 1962, the United States could not allow security to depend on this or that decision of Cuba, particularly once it comes to possess nuclear capabilities under Soviet sponsorship. And I actually show in the paper that this indeed was what the Soviets had planned in the long term, at least for their tactical nuclear capabilities. They planned to devolve those capabilities to Cuban army control. And this is precisely what the Americans feared. And actually, without taking this into consideration, it's difficult to understand why Washington reacted so harshly to the deployment, because at this time, there was already parity between Soviet and American nuclear capabilities. So the deployment actually didn't change the nuclear balance to a significant extent. It's only when you take into account the American fear of the Cubans coming to possess those capabilities that this harsh reaction actually comes to make sense. So incoherence was the outcome during this early period, and that US military threats effectively denied Cuba the opportunity to accommodate the Soviets' outsourcing strategy. But after the missile crisis, the Soviets switched to an insourcing strategy, which meant that the priority was to dominate the alliance's military efforts so that Cuba could not drag the Soviets by a leash. And because the Cubans remained highly vulnerable, they had no choice but to accept Soviets' demands for a minimalist military posture. So here we see that Cuba's military growth began to stagnate once the Soviets switched to an insourcing strategy. So I pushed three major takeaways from this empirical exercise. The first is that contrary to collective goods theory, there is no straightforward correlation between the leading power security commitments and strategic coherence. Reduced commitments or threats thereof are only effective when an insourcing power tries to rein in a militarily vulnerable ally. Second, strategic coherence does not reliably improve with the severity of the allies' threat environments. Among the two allies, Cuba was the more threatened, but its vulnerability meant that it was denied the opportunity to accommodate Soviet outsourcing from 1959 to 1962. And most importantly, I argue that military security in interstate alliances is not, and I argue cannot, be a collective good. The reason is that under anarchy, external security commitments necessarily fail the non-excludability and non-rivalry tests that distinguishes collective goods. So in conclusion, in this paper, I addressed the following question: why do a leading great powers allies sometimes reconcile their military capabilities with the aims of its grand strategy? And why do they sometimes prove unable to do so? This is just another way of saying why do leading powers fail to achieve strategic coherence in their military alliances. I find that incoherence is likely when the leading powers grand strategy aims to outsource military capabilities to a vulnerable ally, or when the leading power tries to insource military capabilities when dealing with a relatively invulnerable ally. So one important contribution of this research is to show that alliances effectively aggregate military capabilities only under certain conditions, and my theory illuminates what those conditions look like. Another implication is that collective goods theory, despite its influence, represents a shaky foundation for theory and policy. My theory offers a less optimistic analysis in the sense that it undermines the notion that allies will uniformly adjust their military capabilities if only the leading power musters the political will to credibly withhold its commitments. But the evidence suggests that my theory is a much more robust analytical lens to understand the problem of strategic incoherence in modern alliances. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joshua. Julia, please.
So fascinating theory, but here is again, because maybe we didn't have enough time to really study your papers enough, but I'm suffering a little bit from the definitional issues here. So I'm not sure if you might want to consider including really a definitional index to your theory, because for instance, leading powers, alliance, vulnerability, and strategic incoherence not being themselves defined as the terms are subject to varied interpretations, right? And also later on in your paper, you do introduce some specific alliances, you know, such as China and Soviets versus, you know, Chinese and Cuban. And the other thing I'm trying to follow is the alliance necessarily supposes that there is an opposition, and you know, the policy considerations in your theory, I think, or let's put it differently, I think geopolitical considerations may significantly influence the outcome of your theory. So I wonder if you need to divide it more along the alliances that you're examining, define the terms that you're using to build this analysis, and then reach a conclusion, or, you know, answer those questions in relationship to specific alliances. Because I think if you do it in global terms, it becomes very confusing, because geopolitically different alliances, different allies, different leading powers have different agendas all the time. The agendas are fluid, the alliances are fluid, right? So, yeah, I'm wondering if some clarification may make it easier for readers to follow your basic premise and then the theoretical conclusion that you're reaching. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you very much for those comments. So your first comment had to do with the definitional or conceptual aspects of these terms that I'm laying out here. I fleshed them out a little bit in the paper, but yeah, in future presentations, I'll try to give a kind of a more upfront exposition of those terms in my presentation as well. So thank you for that. And if I understand your second comment correctly, do tell me if I'm reading this right. So you're saying that different alliances based on their, say, geopolitical circumstances have different agendas. So you have trouble kind of imagining how these concepts such as outsourcing or insourcing that I lay out can travel across these alliances in a neat manner. So maybe it's important for us to kind of segment these alliances and take them for the kinds of agendas that they were pursuing in their own time, rather than lay out these kind of global terms that are supposed to apply generally across these alliances. Is that a correct way?
That's right. And my other thought is, just as we're talking now, is that if you're focusing on the strategic alliances in the Soviet, Chinese, US space, it's one thing. But if you bring in NATO and EU, those considerations will change significantly, I think, in terms of alliance strategy. So you might want to consider and explain as part of your thesis if you're limiting your findings to a particular alliances, and maybe in even particular time frame. I think that's what you're doing, right? Or maybe I'm misreading it.
So I actually I would dispute the idea that terms of these concepts such as outsourcing or insourcing do not apply to NATO. Actually, the key empirical chapter in my larger dissertation isn't Soviet alliances, it's actually NATO during the early Cold War. I argue that President Eisenhower pursued an outsourcing strategy toward Western Europe, which, to just give you a brief summary, it incited incoherence with Western Germany, because Western Germany was too vulnerable to Soviet preventive military measures to accommodate Eisenhower's outsourcing strategy. Eisenhower actually, in the long term, he envisioned turning West Germany into a nuclear power in its own right, and he failed to do so. That was what the Second Berlin Crisis was all about. And afterwards, Kennedy transitioned US grand strategy to an insourcing strategy, where now the priority was to rein in the Allies in Western Europe. And this time, incoherence occurred not with West Germany, but with France. What we know today as the friction between de Gaulle and Kennedy, which eventually led to the schism within NATO's combined command structure, was actually this incoherence that was manifesting because Kennedy was trying to impose these draconian controls on the Western European allies, and France was too invulnerable to have to put up with any of that, which explains what happened there. So, I think I'm a firm believer in general abstractions and social science concepts. They should be taken as what they are. They are, useful heuristics that help us explain broad phenomena in international politics, and that's what I'm trying to do in the dissertation.
No, but that's great. Your comments really nailed it for me, and then now I understand what you're trying to do. So I'm just suggesting that you might want to set out your theoretical background against the geopolitical factors and just explain exactly that you have indeed considered it across broad spectrum, and your position is to find a broad theoretical I don't know if empirical and theoretical really go into the same sentence, but you're looking for support to a broad-based theory, but you have included all those other major players. So now I agree with you.
Yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much. I'm actually, it feels weird to say, but I'm not all that interested in the long run in the Soviet, Sino-Soviet cases. I'm interested in theory building. That's my ultimate goal. So I'll just try to put that more upfront in both in my paper and my presentations from now. Thank you very much.
I think that would be enormously helpful, and thank you. It's a fascinating theory. So I'm looking forward to reading more about it once you publish it. Thank you very much.
No comments from my side, Joshua. I just want to say that I'd love to discuss with you Polish-American alliance and how it fits into your theoretical framework. That would be something fascinating. And if we could schedule a meeting after this conference, that would be perfect. So now let me open this Q&A session. Maybe you got some comments to your colleagues, to the other participants, or maybe there's any comment from our listeners.
Can I, if I may,
Sure.
pose a question to Steve? As you might imagine, I was very interested in your study that deals specifically with the US kind of dimension of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And my question is kind of a broad-based one. So your entire study is premised on this idea that the Cuban Missile Crisis was preceded by an intelligence collection failure on the part of the US intelligence community, right? And my question in that regard is, what leads you to, so this is your dependent variable. It's one value of your dependent variable, which is intelligence collection failure. And presumably the other end of that variable is success. What would success look like? Because I'm having trouble grasping why you think it was such a failure. The Soviets, Khrushchev, he authorized Operation Anadir in May 1962. The US first caught a whiff of that something fishy was going on in Cuba around August, and then things escalated to the point where into a full-blown crisis in October. So it took them 3 months to first detect signs that something fishy was going on in Cuba, right? So what would constitute success? If they discovered it in 1 month, would you deem it a success? If they, or do intelligence capabilities have to be so robust that the Soviets don't even try something like this in the first place? Like, I'm just having, because in my mind, what the Cuban Missile Crisis represents to me is actually a success of US intelligence collection capabilities. The Soviets were gradually streaming capabilities into the Caribbean. The US, detected it early on and nipped it in the bud before the capabilities became fully operationalized, in which case the US wouldn't have been able to do anything because Cuba would have become, an impenetrable fortress, as Khrushchev called it, right? Its deterrence capabilities would have been too strong for the US to, threaten to attack it, or, so on and so forth. But it caught that and nipped that effort in the bud before it was too late. And to me, that is success, right? So, I'm just wondering, what makes you characterize this event as an intelligence failure? If you insist on calling it a failure, then what would success look like? If they discovered it in a week, would you think that's successful? Like, what is kind of the cutoff that you deem for success and failure in this regard?
Yeah, thank you, Joshua, for that question. That's really insightful and a very good question. I think, yes, you are correct that the U.S. intelligence community did discover the missiles fairly quickly, in terms of the unfolding of the crisis. But one of the things that the CIA did that really limited the ability to even get to that point was the photo gap. And I think it was kind of weighing that fear of being, having one of their U-2 planes shot down versus being able to see what was going on in Cuba. But at the same time, you're getting all of this NSA message traffic coming into analysts at the CIA and NSA saying that there's something happening on the island. There's a large amount of vehicles moving. There's a large amount of equipment. A lot of the ships pulled into ports, and they had a canopy basically built over the port so that you could not see from the air what was being unloaded. But Cuban civilians were reporting that they had seen eyewitness accounts of large cylindrical objects being unloaded from the ships. And the CIA tended to dismiss many of those reports. They had over all of the Cuban refugees, from 1959 to 1962, Cuba was still a country in transition, and the refugees were still pouring out of Cuba, and they were going to these processing centers in Florida, and CIA were, taking notes of, account after account of missiles being moved around on the island. And the CIA dismissed it as, well, this is probably just Soviet disinformation. So part of it was, understanding what was real and what wasn't. And I think the biggest failure was the fact of the tactical missiles were completely missed. And the British actually had sent a cable to the American ambassador and said, hey, I think we see some missiles moving around in a particular on a particular road, and the Americans just said, "Oh yes, we're aware of those missiles," but they dismissed it, and they did not realize they were actually tactical nuclear missiles. So I think those were kind of the elements of failure. But you're absolutely correct. I think in the overall long-term perspective, yes, it was a success. And in fact, much of the literature, you kind of see two camps in the literature. There are, quite a few authors who agree with you that yes, this was indeed a success. But there are a number of others, like, for example, Dobbs, who really kind of takes a very critical approach to the crisis and says there were a lot of mistakes, a lot of missteps, and had things perhaps, again, going back to Juliet's, mentioning of the diplomatic element, perhaps if there could have been better proof brought sooner with, photographic evidence or intercepts, and just taken diplomatically using that approach, perhaps that could have, shorted the movement of missiles to Cuba, at least, stopped it. And the problem is that by the time the U-2 overflight spotted the missiles, those missiles were already in place, and they did not know whether or not they were operational, and whether or not there was, a given period of time to make them operational, and they did not know where they were at in that window. So absolutely, I think you're correct, but I think, even the experts and the authors that I read are kind of divided on that issue. And so I kind of came down on the side of being, critical that actually I think the CIA could have done better. But thank you. That's a very good question.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that makes sense. I just, it's still, I would still be careful with defining what you mean by failure in this sense. Is it failure in the large policy outcome kind of sense? Because that clearly, that doesn't obtain, right? But what you're describing there to me is you're essentially describing, routine noise that takes place within the intelligence community. And it's just, to me, it seems important to kind of say, okay, with this much noise, this should be considered an intelligence, collection failure. Because to say that there should be no noise at all, that's just, implausible. It's just a too unrealistic of a bar to expect from any intelligence collection agency or community. And even the point that you mentioned about the tactical nuclear weapons, so I'm familiar with that episode. I don't know, to me, is it such a big deal that they didn't detect the tactical nuclear weapons? I mean, they these weapons couldn't reach southwestern Florida, right? They were just, what they could do is they could be launched at an invasion force, amphibious invasion force. But even there, it's unlikely that, if the Soviet commanders on the island or the Cuban forces on the island actually used, tactical nuclear weapons against an amphibious landing force, then all hell would have broken loose, and it wouldn't have been good for them. So it's unclear to me that it actually mattered so much that the tactical nukes went undetected. So it's those kinds of fuzzy aspects of what they call success and failure that I think is really important for your project.
Thank you for that. That's a really good point.
I don't want to prevent people from going to dinner, but I just have some quick, simple questions. So first of all, for Stephen, so I was surprised to hear that actually the Soviet Union delegated the authority to use nuclear weapons to, I don't know, people in Cuba. And I was surprised to hear that because I know that Soviet nuclear submarines didn't really have the authority to launch nuclear weapons. And so those weapons were locked and a code was needed to launch nuclear weapons. And so I was surprised to hear that. And so I was just wondering about what sources you use to make that claim. And quickly to Joshua, just a clarification question. So you mentioned that actually what the United States was worried about was Cuba becoming an independent nuclear state. Did you mean by that, but actually the Soviet Union was planning to give nuclear weapons to Cuba, or was it more sort of nuclear sharing kind of arrangement?
Joshua, did you want to answer that first?
No, well, the question was addressed to you first, so I think you should go first.
Actually, yes. The Soviets did actually give the nuclear capability was, according to one source, that Khrushchev told Castro that Castro would have authority to launch the weapons. And Castro claimed at one point that he actually pushed the button and nothing happened. Now, and whether or not that's just bravado on Castro's part and saying, look, I was willing to, end the world kind of thing, or whether or not that was true, I really don't know. That source is from an American doctor who traveled and visited Cuba in the 1980s. But in terms of Russian nuclear submarines, actually, there was an article that was just shared with me by Dr. Stindy just this week, and we were talking about it, that there was a Soviet submarine commander who had lost communication with Moscow, and a number of the Soviet submarines in his fleet had actually come to the conclusion that war was occurring and that they needed to launch their missiles. And that submarine commander said, no, we don't have enough information yet, and said, no, we're not going to do that. So and later, many years later, at the time he was kind of looked down upon by the Soviet Union, and now today he's considered a hero. But in terms of actually having nuclear weapons, yes, in fact, those FKR missiles were in Cuba for many years, even after the crisis, because America did not know about them. And we have to remember too, and going back to Joshua's comment about, is it really that big of a deal? We have a military base, an American military base in Guantanamo on the island of Cuba. So that's a very strategic location for us. And of course, the vulnerability there is significant. We don't want to, if those tactical missiles were to have been launched at an invasion force, most likely some of those missiles would have also been launched at Guantanamo as well.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
Yeah, just to build on Stephen's excellent response a little bit. Launch authority was delegated for the tactical nuclear missiles to Soviet commanders on the island. Launch authority for the R-14s and the R-12s, so the ICBM, the IRBMs and the MRBMs, was held by Moscow. And later, as the crisis reached its height, the Soviets sent the order, Moscow sent the order, you shouldn't use tactical nuclear weapons, even if the US launches an invasion. But importantly, this is actually super important. Moscow never had what we call today negative technical controls over those tactical nuclear weapons, right? So even if they ordered the commanders not to use them, if push comes to shove, it's probably the case that we could bet that they probably would have used it to salvage the units. Now, this is a neat segue to your second question to me. Let me just share a quotation here in the chat. So during the course of the crisis, right, the Americans are debating, okay, what do these missiles actually mean? And what President Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, says is, do they actually matter? I mean, they already had enough to blow us up anyways before the deployment. And Robert Kennedy says, okay, but let's say in South America a year from now, we have these things in the hands of the Cubans. Then some problem arises in Venezuela, and you've got Castro saying, you move troops down to that part of Venezuela, we're going to fire these missiles, okay? And what this is saying is that the deployment, if in some point in the future, if control over these capabilities came to be shared or handed off to the Cubans, it would have disrupted America's hold on regional hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. And that's what really concerned the Americans. Without this consideration, it's very unclear why Washington should react so harshly to the deployment. I mean, when you read stories about the Cuban Missile Crisis, you hear things like, oh, the Soviets deployed missiles 90 miles off the US coast, right? Okay, but they already had enough ICBMs to destroy the United States anyways before that, right? So it doesn't really change the nuclear balance in any significant way. It's only this kind of lingering possibility that that control might be handed off to local actors, which the Soviets were actually planning to do in the long run. They were at the very least planning to hand off the tactical nuclear weapons to the Cubans. It's only when this consideration is taken into account that you come to understand why the Americans feared the deployment so much, right?
Very good.
maybe last final comment, politics is not always rational. That is something we often forget, and we shouldn't, I believe. Lami mentioned something about the dinner. It's bad, actually. That is my final destination. It's 2 a.m. right now in Poland. So I'm definitely not going to eat any dinner right now. But anyway, I would like to thank you so much for your brilliant presentations, papers, and your comment that you have shared with us. I really enjoyed this panel discussion, even though it's 2 a.m. And I really hope that we are going to stay in touch in the future. And as I promised, I'm going to send you your papers with more of my detailed comments from my side. Juliet, thank you so much for your participation. Please take a floor to say a few words to our participants.
Thank you very much. It was my pleasure and honor to read your papers. Good luck on your research. Don't stop there. There's plenty of follow-up issues in every dissertation that we've heard. And I hope you'll put it to good use. And please do share your published research with us. I think Jakob and I would really enjoy reading the finished material. So thank you very much and good luck to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really
Thank you.
appreciate it.
Enjoy your dinner.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Juliet. Thank you, Yoko.